I'm going to try to talk about some of the theory behind the drill sequence that I helped them develop. And we're specifically going to talk about flexion extension. I might add in a little bit of ulnar, but we're primarily going to focus on flexion extension. And we're going to look at it from a couple of different perspectives. So perspective number one will be geometry and basically matching up some of these looks that we see with a good impact position for most tour pros. And then we'll talk about the dynamics or the motions and how flexion of the lead wrist can help support some of the motions that we're trying to accomplish that will help us get into the impact position. But I thought first, you want to start with kind of the end goal. So first, I wanted to start by talking a little bit about where we're trying to get to at impact and why this kind of flexion or more flexed position in the lead wrist is important. So we'll look through just a handful of tour pros, where they are at setup and then where they are at impact. And we'll talk a little bit about why this happens, but in general, you'll see that comparing setup to impact, at impact, we're going to have a little bit more shaft lean. The hands are going to be about 4 inches closer to the target, give or take. We'll dive into what that does. It creates some things that help us produce more distance as well as consistency. But as a starting point, we want to accept that we're trying to get our hands there. And what we'll see from the down line is a big part of what gets our hands there is the rotation of the pelvis and the spine. So essentially, if we just have our hands staying out in front of our body, if we turn our pelvis, our belly button, and our sternum in the direction of the target, you can see that the hands would naturally get a little bit more forward. Now, we'll talk about what that would do to the club face and why the lead wrist flexion is important for hitting it straight if you're going to get into this kind of tour impact position. So here's another example, someone with a kind of drastically different grip than, say, Roy McIlroy, but you'll still see the hands getting a little bit more closer to the target, a little bit higher, a little bit further away from the body, as the body has gotten into this rotated and slightly side bent position. That's what positions the hands where we want them for impact. So handful of, or a few more examples, we'll just kind of take a quick look. How much the hands get forward varies a little bit club to club. It'll be a little bit more with the shorter and mid irons and a little bit less with the driver and fairway wood. But because we want to have the body in that rotated side bend position, compared to the body, they're going to be a little bit more ahead. So I've got a few pictures kind of taken from my book. I think that the overhead perspective can make it a little bit easier to visualize some of these changes. So if we're looking here, we can see that we're starting with some amount of angle in that left wrist. And then at impact, in order to move the hands forward, there are a few other things that you could do, but the easiest way is to just change the wrist from a little bit of extension towards flexion. Depending on the grip strength, it'll typically move somewhere in the 15 to 30 degree range in that general direction. So there's just a little close up. You'll also see some changes in the trail wrist where it gets a little bit more extended, and the forearm will be in a slightly different position as well. But again, today we're going to focus primarily on what's happening with that lead wrist flexion. Okay, so why does impact look this way? Why do tour pros get into this impact position? I already mentioned there's two things we're going to look at, the geometry of it and the dynamics of it. The geometry is essentially by getting the hands further forward. If I have a club here, as the hands go forward, if I made no other change to the club face, then what would happen is the club face would point more to the right. And so in order to get the club face pointing more at the target or less to the right, I have to twist it a little bit this way. And to twist it that way with my hands ahead, that's primarily going to come from the flexion of the wrist with a combination of supination. And what that what that does, by having the shaft leaning forward like that, it allows us to make contact closer to the sweet spot. So if I have the ball kind of sitting on the ground, I'll try to get this as close to the camera as I can. If the club is straight up and down, you could see that it would make contact towards the bottom of the club or on the like the perimeter of the club. And as we start moving it forward, the contact point moves slightly higher up the club face. So we hit the ball in the sweet spot with a little bit less loft, or what we call lower dynamic loft. Both of those give us higher ball speed. And by having the shaft leaning forward, it allows us to make solid contact, which gives us a little bit better spin as well. The flexion of the wrist is one of the easiest ways to get the hands to be forward like that. If I kind of locked my wrist in this position, in order to get the hands forward, I'd have to kind of separate my arm from my body. And you notice when I did that, if I separate my arms from my body that way, that will tend to open the club face. Where if I just do it more by the movement of the wrist, it's a lot easier for me to get the club face pointing in the general direction of the target. Now, by having the hands forward, it also helps us create this flat spot where essentially, if I was to just swing the club kind of around a fixed point at the end of the grip, the club would be traveling down towards the ground at a consistent rate, kind of like this. Well, if simultaneously, as I'm swinging it down like this, I was to pull the grip up, then what you can see is the club will travel in a more flat bottom of the swing. So it'll change less. That decreased change, or the decreased kind of change in height and in to out, tends to create more consistency. It's a pattern that we see among the best golfers. And one of the keys is getting the club face a little bit more square earlier. Typically, the motions that's going to square the club face later is going to accompany more of a flip pattern. So from a geometry standpoint, the flat left wrist helps with the shaft lean, helps with the flat spot, helps with the majority of elements that help create consistency. From a dynamics perspective, the flexion of the lead wrist allows us to create more of the speed from the lower body and pelvis, because the lower body and pelvis turning, if the arms stay connected, will bring the hands forward, and it will create this shaft lean, which would point the face off to the right. Specifically, the movement of the wrist, where it's got a little bit of flexion and ulnar deviation, tends to activate more the muscle chain on the bottom side of the arm, which includes the tricep, which helps keep that arm straight, and that helps connect the movement of the wrist to the movement of the rib cage and the shoulder. The other thing that it tends to do is when I'm in this flexed and ulnar deviated position, kind of like this, it creates an element of club face stability. So if you're just sitting there and you flex the wrist, let's say 10, 20 degrees, and then point your thumb down, you'll find that now if you go to move your shoulder, your wrist can stay relatively stable. Where if you were to go the other way, if you were to hinge it up and extend, now as you move it, there's like a little bit of interplay or float in the wrist unless I held it really tight. So what pros tend to do is they tend to use some of this kind of tension in order to create stability, rather than muscle activation and muscle tightness to create the stability, which is what a lot of newer golfers, recreational golfers, tend to do. So how do we get into this position? Let's talk about the sequence of the release. So we've already indicated the wrist has two movements. The forearm has one as well. So the wrist movements are going to be flexion extension, which is typically demonstrated more like this. And then we have ulnar and radial deviation, or hinge and unhinge. And then we have supination and pronation. And typically the release sequence is going to be a little bit of flexion, followed by ulnar deviation, followed by down at the bottom, more of that supination. So if we'll look at it graph-wise, but you can see some of this on video. It's hard to see some of the nuances because the reference frame is constantly changing and you don't have a camera like locked on right on the wrist. So that's where a device like HackMotion or when you're getting data makes it a whole lot easier to see the timing and the amount that you're going in. But if we look over here, this is during the takeaway for Adam Scott. You can see that there's some angle there in that wrist. So the wrist is in a little bit of extension, kind of like this. And then at this same point or hand height on the way down, now the wrist has moved from there to there. And if you look over here, you can see this is kind of the timing for Adam Scott when he starts to do that flexion move or when he starts to do that motorcycle move that we talked about. So that's the first one and one of the most important. Graphically, when we're using the HackMotion, if we're looking at the flexion extension, this is, say, somewhat normal pattern where we have a little bit of flexion in the takeaway and then extension as we go up towards the top of the swing. And you'll see that it starts to flex as we're changing direction or even a little bit before. And then it reaches a maximum point somewhere before impact. And then we're losing it somewhat gradually on the way through. Most of that is because of the body bracing and speed rather than like an active flick of the club, which you might see more with a golfer who's exhibiting more of a flip pattern. The second piece is looking at ulnar deviation. And ulnar deviation has been a controversial one for quite some time because early in golf instruction, the cast was one of the kind of dominant patterns that we could easily see on video, and it just got misappropriated to ulnar deviation. It said, don't move your wrist this way, when a cast is really more about flexion extension and what's happening at the arm or the tricep. So if you look, again, this is a little tricky to see on video. It's much easier to see with graphs. But at this point here, you can see the wrist is fairly flat compared to the forearm. And then as we get into here, he started to do the unhinge move. And now we'll see there's a little bit more angle there at the bottom of the hand. If we look over here at impact, you can see the unhinging movement kind of creates more of a straightness here in the wrist, or the club is closer to in line with the lead forearm. So those are some signs you can look at on video or with the graph in order to see ulnar deviation. I think one of the more important parts of looking at ulnar deviation is not specifically the amount, but some of the timings, especially the timing of how long it stays in that ulnar deviation. A lot of golfers who exhibit more of a flip pattern will kind of quickly rehinge the club through impact. And when you rehinge the club, that also closes the face, so it can cause some pulls and some diggy contact. And then the more kind of classic way of looking at lead wrist supination would be looking at the position of the left arm here. We can see the glove is facing the camera and the elbow is facing the target. And then at this point, the glove and the elbow are pointing in the kind of same direction away from the camera. So to go from the elbow basically pointing this way and the palm pointing that way, if I didn't change anything to get into this position, it would basically be supinating the forearm like that. Now, the HackMotion system looks at more of a global supination. So this can be still useful. I find golfers who tend to have trouble squaring the face will be a little bit lower in terms of the supination. And some golfers who hook the ball will tend to get not just supination, but also a big internal rotation of the shoulder. And so the motion will be quite high. But again, just tying it all together, the wrist sequence, we want to get a little bit of that flexion, a little bit of that ulnar deviation, and then it blends into rotation down at the bottom. That accompanies getting into that kind of tour impact body position. It doesn't guarantee it, but it makes it a whole lot easier. So with those, typically, if you focus on the flexion first, that can help support some of the other movements. We'll talk about kind of some of these specifics as we get into like power sourcing in transition. But oftentimes, if you're creating more of the speed with your arms, you will tend to pull that wrist into extension, as opposed to if you're creating more of the speed with the body, it lines up again because of what happens with the shoulder and the forearm as a result of what's happening at the wrist. It lines up with body rotation a lot better. So when in doubt, if you check your video or look at the HackMotion sensor and you see that you're either not getting enough flexion at some point or losing it down at the bottom, I would typically focus on the flexion first, but then probably look at some of the complementary movements, such as how much you're powering it with your arms, where your weight distribution, etc. In fact, if you're struggling with getting into a good impact position, we'll talk about two of the main things to kind of look at. But here's another picture that I pulled from my book that demonstrates this is more of a kind of classic flipping pattern. And this is more of kind of that lead wrist flexion style. So you can see at impact how that wrist is pretty flat, where here the wrist has more extension. The trail wrist is extended, and here the trail wrist is flat. You can see coming into impact, this golf club is pointing like way over here, where this golf club is pointing closer to the general direction of the target. And then as it comes through, this golf club is getting wider, which helps with more of a shallow brushing of the ground, where this golf club is getting narrower, which creates more of an abrupt change and requires more timing. So two of the big barriers, if you've been trying to work on lead wrist flexion and it's just not working, you're not getting really good contact, two of the big barriers would be kind of like the geometry of your weight being too far back, especially your upper body being too far behind the ball, or your shoulders being a little bit too open. What I mean by that is, in a good golf shot, if we were to circle back to that impact position, we would see that the shoulders compared to the body would be pointing more to the right. This is where some golfers describe it as feeling like back to the target or keeping the right shoulder back. But if the shoulders are in this alignment, it's much easier to then get the release to be out or wide. If the shoulders are in this position and you tried to get more out or wide, you would hit a massive pull. So usually what would happen is if the shoulders get open too steep, kind of like this, then the wrists are going to show some type of compensation or adjustment in order to get the club pointing more at the target. From a dynamics position or a sequencing position, typically this pattern here where it looks like we've casted the club with the wrist, really what's happened is we've powered the swing by kind of pulling down and straightening the arms, kind of more like this. And often that's accompanied with a early movement of the shoulders as well. So if you are struggling with either your impact position, like over on the left, that's more geometry, or if you're struggling with transition and some of the dynamics, then you're going to struggle a little bit with getting into this lead wrist flexion. And so that's where we kind of came up with, or we figured out how to do it programmatically, how I normally teach the sequence, which is in most sports, if you are new to the sport, you're going to start with kind of setup, like how do I hold the ball? And then what are the force activation patterns? So basically, what's the contact like, or what's the release like? Like we'll use the example of tennis. You would probably learn to hold the racket, and then you would learn the angle and the location of where you want to make contact. So I've always used the framework of I want to build a good release first, and then it'll be more scalable. So I'll be able to make a bigger swing. I'll be able to swing at different tempos, and I'll still be able to make good contact because my release and my ground contact will be pretty good. If I know where my body needs to be and where my arms need to be, I'm going to hit the ball relatively solid. So the drill sequence that I like to use is kind of like a 9-3, which is basically a release drill, and then work on getting to the top of the swing. So working on backswing training and getting into a good position at the top, and then trying to work on transition. And then ultimately, once you've worked on all three, the real nuance and magic to kind of maintaining your golf game is understanding your patterns of where it breaks down. Jack Nicklaus said that most golfers end up with like 3 to 5 keys that make their swing work. So you might have one key for a feeling of either the body or the arms at impact. You might have one key feeling for the backswing or the top of the swing, and you might have one key feeling for transition. And when your swing gets off, it's one of those keys. The good thing about having something like HackMotion is it's a lot easier to see it getting off compared to looking at video. I have a bunch of students who continue to see me even though their game gets to autopilot, because they have a hard time reading the video and seeing how it's getting off. And so they just like a second set of eyes, or specifically my set of eyes, to help them figure out which of their keys is starting to drift. But in the system, we talked about the release training. So with a 9 to 3, I usually look at getting the club to about belly button height. But one of the keys to the 9 to 3 is the start of the 9 to 3 should be where it would be in the downswing, not necessarily where it would be at the end of a perfect takeaway. And so as a result, most of the time with a 9 to 3, you're going to feel like you're a little bit more stacked over that front foot, or your weight is a little bit more forward, and you're going to feel like the arms are a little bit more kind of narrow in kind of this position here. So I'm demonstrating in that picture where I was getting to the top of the backswing, but then as I get ready to go, you can see if I sequence correctly, if I turn my lower body, that helps get my arms in front, so then I can deliver a good release. Where a lot of golfers who struggle with the 9 to 3, they'll kind of sway off the ball or just move with their arms kind of like this. And then when they try to go geometrically, they're too far behind the ball, and it's hard to get good low point unless they chicken wing and pull things across the ball. So if you're struggling with the 9 to 3, either you're just not quite sure on how to do the release. That's where the feedback training from the HackMotion will be awesome. It'll help you dial in that left wrist. Or your upper body is out of position, or you're kind of powering it too much by spinning your upper body and your shoulder blades are out of position rather than your lower body. Once we feel like you can make a pretty good impact drill or release drill, then go ahead and let's work on the top of the swing and getting into a good transition. So I have this picture again from my book where this position here is roughly where the club, the speed in the handle starts to slow down as you're transferring the energy from your hands to the club. So in my head, this is more or less where the release really starts in a full swing. Now, obviously, if you did a shorter shot, you're kind of like already starting mid-release, but that's actually helpful for training your release. But when you're doing your swings, the reason I like to train a 10 to 2 or a 10 o'clock shot is that's basically the start of the release. So from here, we would want to rotate the lower body and then have a little bit of flexion in the wrist, a little bit of ulnar deviation, and kind of feel the natural supination timing down towards the bottom of the swing. Now, when you start getting into the bigger swings, you have more things that can go wrong, especially looking at the steep and shallow balance. In general, when we're looking at steep and shallow movements, this is kind of like we're looking at how the club contacts the ground, because we already said that was one of the hallmarks and one of the commonalities of the tour swing is striking the ground or brushing the ground in a shallow manner, just slightly ahead of the golf ball, somewhere 4 to 6 inches. In order to do that, you want to have the swing at the bottom to be wider and moving in a more horizontal fashion rather than things that would steepen it, as I've demonstrated or as I've depicted here. Things that would steepen and make the club approach the ground quicker would be more vertical or narrow. So this would be more vertical. The club is going to be approaching the ground from a higher position given any different distance, or more narrow, the club is going to be higher approaching the golf ball given the same kind of distance behind the ball. In general, if you tend to get steep as your major pattern, you will struggle with more pulls, potentially slices if you keep the club face more square to the target. You'll likely hit the have toe hits. You'll likely have deep or potentially no divots, depending on what you do with the low point. Usually, driver is the toughest club to be steep with, and wedges are the easiest club to be steep with. So you'll be a better wedge player or short iron player and struggle more with the driver. This typically comes from an overuse of the upper body, underuse of the lower body, and results in some of the scooping chicken wing pattern that we like. One just easy way to figure out if you tend to err on more steep or shallow is what lie you prefer. Typically, steep golfers prefer the ball below their feet, and shallow golfers prefer the ball above the feet. So shallow is going to be the opposite of that, more of the block hook pattern, thin, good driver, poor wedge, and lots of lower body or loss of posture. Okay, so I hope that walks through kind of some of the logic of where we're trying to get to and why we're going to dial in working on the release first and then the transition. The release is really going to come down to getting that lead wrist flexion, ulnar deviation, and getting your body used to being more in this stacked position where your weight is forward, as well as having some of the rotation and side bend. And then transition is going to be more about kind of the weight distribution between your feet and the position of your spine and really the timing of your shoulder spin or your shoulders getting more open. To complement that, we're going to feel the motorcycle move or a little bit of that wrist flexion, and then blending into more of this ulnar deviation and supination down at the bottom. But I figured it'd be more fun to kind of talk through some of the questions once we have this framework in place. So if you didn't send them in, I've got the printed list that Reinhold sent first. Otherwise, I'm sure some will come in right now.
So Tyler, thanks a lot for the presentation. It was really, really nice. So we're going to be adding more material explaining this in the future. So stay tuned. We're going to be making more videos. So this is, let's say, brief, relatively overview. And obviously, Golf Smart Academy has a lot of content on this as well. So I think let's start. We have a list of questions that came in. And I'll start with a very popular question that let's say a person starts using HackMotion and they see, whoa, it shows them very extended at impact. But I say, like, I'm hitting my 8 iron 140, 145 yards, HackMotion straight. HackMotion shows you are, flipping, you are doing this. And should I change my swing to get flatter wrist at impact? And if I'm managing to hit it straight, then why should I do it?
Yeah, golf is a really kind of interesting game in the sense that there's lots of different ways you can enjoy it, right? If your primary goal is scoring and your primary goal is scoring like tomorrow, then I probably wouldn't make a big change like that if I'm performing consistently or reliably. But what'll happen is you'll reach a plateau where you can't get better unless your technique improves. Whether that's a 90s barrier, an 80s barrier, or a par barrier, you'll reach a barrier where if you want to get better than that, you have to improve your technique. And so he says that he's hitting his 8 iron 140 yards. Well, yes. Now we might have specific problems like the longer clubs. We might have trouble with ball on a downslope or out of really thick rough. Like there might be some scenarios that reveal a pattern in his technique. I personally, I love the nuances of the golf swing. I have a lot of students who just want to build what their version of the tour swing could be. And so in that case, I frequently say there's 3 things that you want to monitor. How the swing is performing. So, okay, he's hitting it straight in 140 yards, but we might look at like the angle that the club is, that the ball is taking off at, and there might be room for improvement there in terms of consistency. So how it performs, how it feels, which he probably, since he's not really changing his swing, he has a comfortable feel. That one we might have to tweak if we decided to make a change, and how it looks either on video or kind of on the data. So the challenge is he likes how it's performing, at least to some level. It probably feels comfortable, but it's going to be limited in terms of the ceiling, and that would show up on more like the data side. So how the video looks or how the graphs look. And so if he is getting too extended, you could look at some of the nuances to figure out, well, where does this really hurt my game? The big problem with flipping or being too extended at impact is it requires more timing. And so what ends up happening is either you have to play consistently, like the classic example of the flipper was VJ Singh. And VJ Singh was known for being one of the range rats who would practice 10 hours a day because he felt if he stopped hitting balls for a couple hours, he lost his rhythm and his timing. Now, he won 10 times in one season or something like that. Like he was a brilliant golfer, but his swing had more timing and he found ways to kind of maintain that timing. The other part to the timing pattern is you will have a hard time either hitting like less than full shots or typically hitting hard shots. Now, I personally get enjoyment from swinging hard at a driver. So for me, if I felt like I had to swing easy on every single swing, that would take away some of my joy. So it really depends on where he wants his game to get to and where his performance is currently.
Yeah, I think that it's a very good point about consistency that a lot of our users are striving for. So obviously you're hitting well one day, but the next day maybe your timing is a bit off and you're suddenly not performing so well. So you think that the same swing can work all the time, but if your release is very timing dependent, then you'll never be as consistent from day to day. So obviously, if you want to improve your scores and enjoy golf every day, then fixing that release will be very helpful.
Yes.
Okay.
There's a great joy in fixing a problem that you've had for many years. I
Yeah.
I get to see it all the time. I love it.
Yeah, exactly. And our users also are like, wow, I never knew I'm that extended and I have to be in this position. And then when they actually learn it, then wow, I've never had such good compression and this impact position ever. And it sometimes really takes just a couple lessons to learn the new
Yeah.
motion. So it's highly recommended.
Okay.
Okay. Then the next question. So it's a player who's 76 to handicap, so a good player, but says the biggest fault is crossing the line at the top. Is there a way that they can use HackMotion, so wrist data, to correct this issue? Maybe they have to work on their trail wrist. What is the recommendation for fixing across the line?
So many times if we're looking at across the line, I would look at the amount of like hinge or radial deviation at the top, as well as extension. With the trail arm, it's going to be a little bit more of like the pronation angle or like the arm kind of flying away. When you get if I were to face you, or sorry, if I was to face this way and go to the top of the swing, across the line is basically when I've done this combination of movement, which would look more like that. So in order to take away that across the line, I would basically pull, like everything gets rotated a little bit more this way. So the left wrist gets a little bit flatter earlier, and it doesn't hinge quite as much. Now, what I tend to find is the tricky thing there is when you get to the top of your swing, your brain has like a signal. It says, okay, I've stretched what I needed to. I'm at the end of the swing. And when you go across the line, that signal is usually happening in your wrist or in your shoulder. And so when you stop going across the line, you no longer get the signal from where you're used to looking. Now you would get more of the signal from somewhere in your core or maybe in your hip that's the end of the swing. And I think that trigger difference is what takes a little bit of getting used to, especially golfers who tend to be able to keep it not across the line or more on plane on a slower swing, but then when they try to swing harder, that's when they just kind of go back to that normal, like overstretch my wrist.
Yeah, so that goes to the point that you mentioned about the two-arm dominant as a power source that
Yes.
screws up a lot of swings. Okay, that's a great answer. Thanks. Then we have a question from a player that's 50 to 60 years old, amateur, and how can they adapt these 4 inches in front, the hands that you mentioned,
Mhm.
they cannot turn their hips and shoulders like a tour pro. So how should they be adapting the ranges and what they should be doing?
Um, yeah, so part of that is speed dependent. So you won't see quite as far of a shift for golfers on the LPGA, for example. So looking at ground contact, looking at handle location, and aiming for, I would say, the maximum that you can do. Now, if you have one specific issue, like let's say the hips don't allow me to turn, then I would probably experiment with turning that front foot out, or maybe even turning the trail foot in the direction of the target to try to get there. Some golfers um, can get there like without hitting a golf ball, and that usually means that it's more of a pattern that's preventing them from getting open. A lot of golfers struggle with getting their hips open, partly because they're used to having their spine pointing in the same direction of the hips, and that's usually accompanied more by like an arm dominant release pattern. If my shoulders are turned to the right of my body, then in order to have my body pointing in the direction of the target, my pelvis would have to be open. And it doesn't have to be a lot. I mean, the lower end of the tour pattern is somewhere around 20 to 30 degrees. You don't have to be, 60, 70 degrees like a Dustin Johnson in order to get the hands forward. Now, if you really have a hard time, like you're just like, all right, my spine is basically fused, then I would probably work on getting my arms more towards the left side of my body, or my arms a little bit more ahead of my body rather than back behind my body, which feels more powerful. So that's kind of the matrix I'd use, or the
Yeah, and
decision.
important, right, that you can get the body more open than you think, even if you're 50, 60. That's possible, but changing the stance a bit, opening, so it's not that impossible, really.
Yeah.
Um, okay, and next question about driver. So the player finds it very useful for irons and hybrids, but how to use it for driver? Is it different? And for driver, uh,
So I have a presentation on YouTube where from the 20, I think 18 World Golf Fitness Summit, where I looked at the 3D using AMM. I looked at the 3D differences between driver and iron swing. And the wrists were fairly similar. Very little change, if any, with the wrist pattern. More of the big differences were what was happening with the body. So what will happen, and that's why when I was careful with how I phrased things early in the presentation, where I talked about it will be a head compared to the body, but with the driver, your upper body will be more behind. So this is how I normally demonstrate it. If I were to get my hands ahead, like with an iron, there you would see a bunch of shaft lean. Let's lower this, make it a little bit more obvious. So if I was to get into that impact position, kind of like this, yeah, with a driver, I would basically have zero loft, and I would be hitting it like a putter along the ground. But if I was to freeze my arms in this position, and then I was to widen my stance a little bit, and now instead of being only 4 degrees tilted, now I go to about 20 degrees tilted. You notice I didn't change my arms, and now the club is more vertical, and it would be where the ball position would be for a driver. So that's part of why typically you'll see um, with an iron, you'll typically see golfers having the ball position somewhere off their left ear, left cheek, kind of like this. But with a driver, will be more off of the outside of the left shoulder. Numbers wise, with an iron, they're going to only be tilted about 4 degrees, so fairly stacked. And with the driver, it's going to be about 20 degrees, the difference between the upper body and the lower body. And it's that difference that allows the hands to basically do the same thing, but one strikes slightly up on the ball or very flat, and the other one strikes more down on the ball with a good flat spot ahead of the golf ball.
So the player who's struggling with the driver should, it's actually not the arms that have to do something different, but it's actually his, probably his struggle is the body adaptations that he has to make.
Yeah, I would take a look at a face on camera and see where the upper body is compared to the golf ball. And if it's too far on top, then the flip that, like, basically what's not working with the wrist is a compensation for the body being out of position.
Yeah, and we also see if, in pro software we have these several players tour who have both iron and driver shots, and the pattern really is the same. And a lot of players maybe think that they need to start, scooping somehow the ball up in the air, and the angles are completely different with the driver. But that's actually not true at all. It comes from the stance.
Yeah. One last point on there. So I talked about geometry and I talked about the dynamics. Dynamics become a really important component to this driver thing because if I'm behind and I'm early with the arms, then the club would hit the ground about 2 feet before the golf ball. So in what I did see on 3D is that you'll tend to have more body powered, or basically hitting it more with the lower body and the lower core in order to be in this 20-degree tilted position and not hit the ground. And so if you're really dominant with kind of firing your arms, you want to try to work on your sequencing in addition to kind of maintaining the same wrist motion.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's a really good answer. Thanks.
Yeah.
So then there's a question about a person is curious about the phrase correct release, because there are different great players that they have moved differently their hands and forearms to release the stored energy and create rotational velocity. Why is this that you discuss as the correct release rather than one of the maybe some other tour players using a bit different? Like I think, for instance, Dustin Johnson releases probably the club a bit differently than Tiger Woods, or yeah.
Yeah. It's a good question. There's there's what the data shows and then kind of what the data means. So as far as what the data shows, you're going to see a fairly wide variety of kind of starting grip orientations. And because of that, the grips, the hands being in a different orientation, if it's very strong or if it's very weak, the direction that the hands are moving compared to the club might vary. Like we talk about trying to get the grip, let's say 4 inches closer to the target. Well, if I have my hand turned completely onto the side, then to make it move in the direction of the target, I would actually hinge. I would radial deviate in order to move my hands that way. If I had my hands in a little bit more neutral position, then it's going to be flexion that's going to move it that way. And if for some reason I had it gripped completely upside down, kind of this way, then it would actually be ulnar deviation that it would move it in that direction. So I think if you look at what the club needs to do as the guiding light as far as why we're making these movements with our release, you'll see a lot more similarity among the pros rather than if you're just looking purely at the wrist movements. Now, what I looked at was more the wrist pattern. So you would tend to see the same global changes, but in varying amounts depending on how they were holding onto the club. So in general, a golfer who had a quite strong grip would move towards flexion, but not all the way there. And a golfer who had a weak grip would tend to move quite a bit into flexion, maybe even more so than the golfer who had more of the strong grip. So the general pattern and the direction that the wrist is moving is going to be very similar, but the amounts make it look dramatic on video and make the descriptions of people having kind of drastically different releases, like it supports that argument. But I think if you just start with where do we want the club to be and why, I think you'll get to some of these conclusions a little bit more logically.
Mm-hmm. There may be follow-up question. The one related to this is that the player understands the concepts, but has a strong grip and has hard time moving the wrist in a more flexed position. So not maybe an absolute flexion, but like decreasing the flexion. And is there a particular grip that you would recommend that would make it easier to get wrist in proper angles on the downswing if the player, for instance, has very strong grip in this case?
Yeah, so I think that this is like a broader question of basically like how do I choose my grip? And I think that that can be not quite so cut and dry because we've seen pros have all different variations. In general, I would probably start with where my body likes to get to at impact. So where am I going to be able to create kind of like the best speed and stable bracing position? And then I would almost reverse engineer it. In general, the more open that my body is going to be, the more that I would have to close it. And so you get to a certain point where you feel like you're closing it as much as you can, and it's still not closed. And that might mean you're closing it as much as you can, and then you start closing it by doing some less advantageous movements. If that's the case, then I would strengthen the grip. One of the places where I usually check grip strength is actually halfway down or around P6. So like when the club is parallel to the ground. This is one of my favorite places to check the club compared to the grip. If you're getting into a position where the club is basically close to matching the V's on the right and left hand, then I would say that you're in a more neutral grip. If, on the other hand, the club face is significantly turned more strong compared to the V's, that would be strong, and some people will be more weak, kind of like this. If you have the club in kind of a weaker position like this, then you are often going to have to like stall, early extend, and flip in order to get the club face closed. And the sneaky one is if you're too closed in this position, then you can't continue to release the forearms correctly, or else you'd hit pull. So what a lot of golfers do, you have two options to avoid hitting it left there. You could either like Dustin Johnson it and get a lot of body turn and shaft lean, or you could, what most golfers do is you're in that stronger position and you start kind of holding off kind of like this. So you actually start kind of like holding off. These are the golfers who on video will have shaft lean, but still have dramatic low point issues where they're hitting lots of fat and thin shots. So if I see that I like where the hands are, the wrists are getting in a good position here, but the club face is just not quite matching up, then I will usually go to a grip change. If I don't like where the hands are, then I'll usually go for kind of changing the wrist pattern. But I use that P6 down the line as a good barometer as to if I need to make a grip change or not.
Okay, that's a good point. All right, next question. So a player who's now getting when he's trying to do more of the forearm supination, he is getting better wrist angles and he's getting less flippy. Have you noticed that actively thinking about forearm supination actually will help him? And is he kind of on the right track of actually trying to really this motorcycle drill and trying to maybe supinate a lot, and that helps him with a flip?
Yeah, so one of the, I would almost say annoying things about golf, I will say that there are some things you have to monitor and some things that are good to focus on. You want to monitor how the wrists are moving, but ideally you're going to find the simplest way to get your wrists to work. Sometimes starting with the flexion helps encourage the other movements. Sometimes starting with the end of the movement and getting more of the supination helps the brain kind of line up what it needed to do earlier. So what I think you have to do is I think you have to understand the concept and then be willing to play around with a couple different options and monitor it so you can see which option works best for you. One of the advantages to working on supination is it is really hard to supinate if you are holding on as tightly as you can. If you are like squeezing the grip down at the bottom, then it's really hard to twist. So you'll end up doing more of kind of like a chicken wing and kind of like buckle type movement. Where if you're trying to supinate, oftentimes you get a little bit more softness in the forearm, and that softness in the forearm helps it do the motorcycle early. It's very hard to do the really good release pattern with a ton of tension, and so starting with that supination might be a great place to go. I tend to default towards the thing that happens first, but some people I'll quickly pivot and work on the thing that happens last to help reverse engineer it.
Okay, so the player who's now hitting better, he's supinating, then he's probably on the right track. He should monitor it, and if the shots are better, his wrist conditions are getting better, then it's working for him.
Yeah, and if one thought helps you do the two or three things, like if he's looking at the graphs and they're all looking better, that'd be awesome.
Okay, then there's one question from a player. He's using the motorcycle drill and he can't keep the hands in flexion in the backswing, but he struggles with downswing and impact. And he's not far off, but the only way he can really get in those ranges is when he drags the handle way past the ball, which limits the release. And do you have any thoughts on the drill to help with a better impact situation in this case?
Um, yeah, oftentimes, without seeing the numbers, without seeing the swing, we're theorizing. But oftentimes, what I see is golfers who have a are able to get into that motorcycle and then kind of lose at the bottom. Typically, don't have enough unhinge or ulnar deviation to balance it out, and that unhinge helps keep the width increasing. If you're in this motorcycle pattern and then you feel like you're holding it off, what can happen is it starts rehinging, and that rehinging essentially like closes the face and moves low point backward. So then you start mishitting it and hitting pulls, and then you feel like you have to really hold it off. So the combination of getting a little bit more of that ulnar deviation, especially longer through the ball, like I showed with the example graph, longer through the ball might allow him to keep that motorcycle going.
Okay.
The other place that I would look would be the body pivot and making sure that the spine is a little bit rotated and the pelvis is open at impact.
Okay, and the next one is exactly about hip rotation. So flexion is one thing, but isn't hip rotation just as important? I think you need to emphasize how when to bend flexion and rotation, especially for mid-high handicappers. So how would you kind of help maybe players to think about how to blend the amount of flexion and rotation?
Um, so if I'm hearing the question right, hip rotation I think is extremely important. I think you have a couple big buckets as far as like the general pivot and kind of controlling where the center of your swing is, how you're creating speed, how you're controlling ground contact, and how you're controlling club face. So those are kind of some of the big buckets. And hip rotation helps with a bunch of those, helps with creating power, and it helps with the low point consistency. So oftentimes, once I've taught kind of the basics of how to hold the club and the basics of where I want the arms to be at impact, then I start working a lot on the pivot. A, it feels more athletic. So golfers kind of tend to gravitate and like more body feels. I think that's like natural. I want to encourage that. And B, that allows you to do kind of more subtle or less with the arms because your brain will trust that you're creating the speed from somewhere else. And it's been one of those things that a lot of pros have described really strong feelings of hitting it with the legs, hitting it with the core, not hitting it quite so much with the arms. We now know that the arms definitely have some roles that they have to do, but they can feel a little bit more passive the more that you get your body involved. So I kind of have a system of approach where I work from impact and follow through kind of backwards. And if the lower body's not open, that's going to be one of the first things we're going to try to work on.
Yeah, and I think we also try to emphasize that obviously wrist is not the only thing that matters, but teaching the hands and wrists correctly to move enables you to add power and rotate correctly. So that's a very, very kind of foundational
The,
block you have to master.
Yes, and the other piece about the arms and hands is I think that people have a lot of golfers have a very poor awareness of it. So they need better feedback. And so I especially like the vibration, the buzzing feature for giving stronger feedback. I've been able to kind of uncover some issues for people who like just can't feel it very well until we just turn up the volume.
Okay, that's yeah, a new hardware feature that we had, the vibration feedback. Okay, so next question. So it's a very kind of theoretical maybe, but the player says that he's getting more shallow, and but he struggles with face control and releasing the club. And maybe you can then walk through how wrist flexion at certain points relates to releasing the club and squaring the face at impact. It was covered in your presentation already, but maybe you can just walk through again in a few minutes.
Yeah, so I often do this kind of demonstration for club face control. The more that I have the club straight out in front and my joints are pretty like loose, you'll see that I can go from open to close very quickly, and it changes quite dramatically. I might be able to move this thing almost 180 degrees with very little effort down at the bottom. If that's my method down at the bottom, so the club is straight out in front of me, the club is going to be twisting so quickly, it's going to require a lot of timing. If, on the other hand, I bring the club back this way, so it's behind my body, kind of like this, because of the tension in my wrists and my forearms, now when I go to close it, you can see that I've greatly reduced the amount that it can move. That's part of what we mean when we talk about kind of club face stability. So if I'm trying to get a more consistent club face, I'm trying to create some of these almost governors so that the club face is changing a little bit slower and more gradual. So that means that I need to have the club further behind me while my hands are in front of me. To do that, I have to use more my body and my core. And the other thing is, instead of hitting it more by flicking the wrists and the arms, I'm going to have my lead wrist more towards flexion and ulnar deviation. That essentially creates more like consistency or stability in the wrist. And then if I hit it more with the body motion, then the wrists aren't going to change as much. I'm going to have a much higher level of club face control, especially for eliminating big left misses. Now, the tricky thing is if I did that the entire time, it would just be a giant chip shot. So I wouldn't be able to create much speed. So then what I want to do is I want to have some of these elements getting kind of loaded here in transition, and then it goes into this unloaded position down at impact, and it kind of maintains that because I'm hitting it more with the body, or it feels like I'm hitting it more with the body on the way through, that my hips and my spine are continuing to move as I'm hitting the golf ball rather than just hitting it with the arms and the hands.
Okay, I think that helped understand it better. Then there's a question. So during the backswing, a player notices that midway they have this dip. They always go in flexion, while the tour players that we measured, they relatively maintain that extension. I think you showed Adam Scott. He also doesn't massively flex in the backswing, so takeaway it stays relatively stable. So, but it seems impossible to achieve for this player. So, what could be the issue there?
Oh, nothing's completely impossible, but some things are difficult. So in order to like, if we reverse engineer it, what a lot of golfers do is they kind of use their wrists and arms, especially kind of pulling the arms like this, and they whip the club inside and they go into flexion, like they're using the wrist to move the club. If, on the other hand, I had the club out in front of me and I used my rib cage and my body to move the hands, then it would be easier for me to keep the wrist in a more neutral position. So a phrase that I use is what gets loaded gets fired. Oftentimes, golfers who want to use their upper body as the main power source will then use the upper body as the main takeaway source to set up using the arms in transition. So what can be tricky is, in order to have the wrist not dominate the movement, I have to have my rib cage, I have to have my body initiate takeaway. That can feel, once you've done it and gotten more comfortable with it, using your body in the backswing helps make the arms feel a little bit more connected and kind of in sync. And that usually gives a good kind of bump in your ability to be more consistent. So essentially, you're using too much arms in your takeaway, and you need to use more body in order to keep the wrist in a more neutral position. It's hard to actively move the club with the wrist if you keep the wrist in a neutral position.
Would you say that when you see this, let's say, big dip really in the data, that could be really something for users to think about, that try to get it?
Yes, I would then, if I saw a big dip in the data, I would look at the video to see if my body was doing anything or if I was just moving the club with my arms.
Yeah, there's this popular question about how to use it as
Yeah.
diagnostic tool.
And it could be either. Sometimes it's the right wrist or the right arm kind of pulling back this way, and it pulls the left wrist into the flexion. So sometimes I have to work on the right arm kind of maintaining its width, and sometimes I have to work on kind of the left side of the body rotating with that left arm. But those are like two dominant takeaway feels for fixing that wrist pattern.
Okay, so that was the takeaway, and now there's also a question about it's quite general, but how to initiate and complete downswing. So maybe talk about this transition sequence and what should be the hands doing, and what should be what the player should be focused on from also HackMotion perspective.
Yeah, there's a couple different kind of feels that people have, but in general, we're trying to use our body to create the speed through the arms into the handle. So I want to use my core and my legs and my spine to basically create some force on the handle while my arms are kind of getting loaded so that then when my body goes into the release, they can like spring release or like let go of that energy. One of the I think more challenging things for a lot of golfers is the hit through the ball is more of a release of a stretch rather than like an active hit. And that's why pros look very smooth when they're doing it because they're like releasing this stretch versus amateurs look very violent because they tend to be more like actively trying to hit at it. So what I like to work on with the top of the swing is kind of like managing the amount of tilt. So managing some of the lateral movement. I want to make sure that I'm getting more or less for an iron that I'm getting my upper body and lower body close to in line with that left heel, inside of the left heel. That will position me so that when my body rotates, that will bring my hands into that position even with that left thigh. So the timing is usually like a little bit of a bump as it's rotating. If you get up there and you just rotate, and if you rotate everything, then you'd come way outside and low point would be backward. And if you never rotate, you would sway too far past the ball and you'd have to get kind of wristy handsy. So the thing for everybody to kind of figure out is this feeling of the blend of a little bit of weight shift, rotation, and the rotation happening from the lower body upward so that the shoulders don't rotate too soon. One of the chief pivot problems for many golfers is that in order to strike a golf ball correctly, I need to have my shoulders be almost in this position at impact. And most golfers want to get their shoulders even with their hips, which means either if my hips were open, my shoulders would be way over the top like this, or I need to have my shoulders and my hips facing the golf ball. So to get into this kind of position at impact, if I came back to facing the golf ball, my shoulders are still that closed, that would look kind of like this here at impact. And getting into that position, I think is one of the goals for a lot of pivot training.
Okay, and I like that you describe also one concept of the hands when they're more relaxed, they shallow, but the shallowing actually opens the face. So you can't just shallow if your face gets open. You have to do the motorcycle drill to close the face. So this kind of relaxed hands shallowing, and then you have to close it. So I think that's important that the wrists have to help there with the closing the face as well.
Correct. Most golfers like develop a pattern where they steepen the club with their arms, which helps close the face and move the low point forward. And so what often happens is when you start trying to shallow, if you start to shallow without getting your body in a better position, contact becomes fat thin and the ball goes off to the right. So you have to like replace those two skills, and the closing the face that you're talking about, like the motorcycle move, helps you get more shallow.
Yeah. So that's a good point. We have a motorcycle drill also in the now the training program in the app. So that's something that users can do. Okay, so then a player is struggling. So P6, the hands
Mhm.
are way behind the right leg, and how do you get them more in front of the right leg? So tour players have it more kind of in front of the right leg, not behind it.
Yes. So we'll address that primarily from a pivot perspective, but we can talk the arms as well. So if the arms are way behind, kind of like this, uh, typically what that means is if I was standing here, the arms are behind the body, kind of like this. So it's the relative difference that is the problem. If I keep my arms in the same position, then what I'd have to do to get my arms in front is keep the shoulders closed. So oftentimes, sounds counterintuitive, but keeping that right shoulder back or that left shoulder forward allows the arms to be more in front. And now, if I just add rotation of the pelvis, now that gets my arms in front of the shoulder. Um,
Mhm.
so usually what's happened is the shoulders have kind of lunged in front, kind of like this. And so if the arms were still in front of them, then you would be way too steep. You would actually like reverse shank it off the hosel from coming so far steep. So the arms getting behind are the complement to the upper body kind of spinning and being a little bit too active. So I'm a big fan in learning how to kind of keep the shoulders or the shoulder blades a little bit more rightward rotated or closed so that then I can get more of the rotation from the hips and the pelvis.
Mhm.
And that pulls the hands more in front. Um,
Mhm.
the only other, like the way you can reverse engineer it from the arms perspective is by keeping, like the old classic, put a towel under your arm or keeping that right arm kind of pinned or in front of your body. Because then what would happen is if you spin, you'll hit the ball terribly. So you start having to feel like the shoulders work on like a little different plane or a little different pattern.
Okay, thanks for that. And then a question is about trail wrist. So what are the benefits and when would you use it on the trail wrist? So HackMotion can measure both the lead wrist, which we are mostly
Mhm.
focused, but a lot of players have problems actually coming from the trail wrist, and a lot of players are using it, they see low value. So when would you be actually focused on the trail wrist and measuring that?
I think for a lot of people, it's good to kind of go back and forth. Uh, in my book and kind of in my system, I tend to say like, look, we have two hands on the club. Ideally, you want those hands working together. So you can see I could separate my hands and they'll basically like shadow or mirror each other. When we really start to get into problems, like I'll have my students do a single arm drill, and often what will happen is the left arm is doing this and the right arm is doing this. So their brain is trying to manage like those two motions there, and it's either going to match more the right or it's going to match the left, but they're not working together. Specifically, I think there are some things that are easier to see with the right wrist. Like sometimes this wrist will stay firm, and so when this kind of right wrist starts flexing early, you won't necessarily see it show up in the lead wrist going into extension as dramatically as you'll see the right wrist going into flexion. So like a midway down cast and seeing some of the arm dominant patterns, I think are really easy to see with the right wrist. And I think that in some ways, the ulnar deviation of the right wrist down at the bottom is almost more important than the ulnar deviation of the left. I think they're both very useful, but I think that you can see um, the timing of the cast and the timing of the rehinge easier on the right wrist.
Okay, yeah, and we have these tour data also for trail wrist in the app, so you can, if you have the pro, you can measure it and see how actually long the player maintains the extension in the trail wrist. So that's interesting. Okay, so a couple more questions. We are approaching the 1.5 hour mark. So regarding a lot of players are asking for advanced players fading and drawing shots. So when would you, if you would ever look at wrists and wrist angles when the player is fading, hitting fades or draws, and what would be you looking for if a player, let's say, wants to learn to draw the ball or wants to hit a fade?
So I will say the data I've seen on that is fairly limited. Not a lot of 3D captures were done asking players to deliberately fade and draw. The data that I have seen, it seems like it was more an adjustment in the body position, especially the shoulders being for their draw being a little, or the thorax, I should say, the chest being a little bit more closed and side bent, and for the fade being a little bit more open. So that had a relative change on the wrists, but it wasn't as dramatic as it was on the body. So I do think you could. The challenge is it's hard to have exactly the same amount of shaft lean, and if you don't have the same amount of forward shaft lean, then the change in the rotation angles would have a bigger impact on the club face. So you wouldn't necessarily be able to just go off of flexion extension or just go off of rotation in order to see where the club face was pointing.
Mhm.
So
Okay.
I think it would be cool if that was possible, but I don't know that we can get there with just a wrist sensor.
All right. And then a person is asking if you recommend 3/4 backswing or a longer backswing if you're capable of making a longer. So should he pick long backswing or 3/4 if he can make both?
So the advantage to a longer backswing is you have more time to hold high force, so you have the potential for creating more speed. The advantage for a shorter backswing, for some people, it's easier to time the sequence. It's easier to be a little like it's easier to be a little bit upper body dominant on a shorter swing than on a longer swing. So for a lot of golfers, they don't really see the benefits that tour pros get from having a little bit longer backswing. So in general, if you're just more of a recreational golfer, I tend to err on feeling like more compact or a little bit shorter. And but if you're, like let's say you're a high school or soon to be college golfer, and you're under loaded as far as speed, then I think you have to look at the length of backswing. And I don't want to confuse length of backswing with making like a full turn. Some people, when they shorten the backswing, they shorten their body movement and they just kind of lift their arms. I don't advocate that. Regardless, what I would want to work on would be kind of feeling like a full rib cage movement. And the shorter swing would just have the arms closer to where they're going to be at impact rather than having them run off a little bit.
Okay. So players saying that if he focuses too much on the lead wrist flexion at impact, he ends up holding the clubs too hard and becomes very armsy. And what would you then advise if that happens?
Yeah, I mentioned before that one of the big compliments to the wrist flexion is the ulnar deviation. And so that creates more of like a tension in the fascia. So then you don't have to grip it muscularly quite as aggressively or hard. So the other thing to kind of watch out for is if the shoulders like are really dominant, then if you do flex the wrist, you can hit a bunch of pulls and it could feel diggy, and a lot of golfers hate that feel, and so then they feel like the hold off move is actually more of a lifting type movement or a disconnect of the shoulder.
Okay. Then another question: is there a problem with flexing wrist at the start of the backswing as opposed to the top or in transition?
The main issue with that is if you start trying to take like less than full swings, half swings, you're relying on this kind of like, I want to say artificial timing, but you're relying on everything all the time and everything that's going to happen in transition. So if you're in a shorter position, you might feel like if you make your normal swing, you're going to hit more pulls. I have one player where basically we set up with the club face 30 degrees closed, and then they just try to keep it there and they try to turn their body, and it works out. She doesn't play more than a couple times a week. So one phrase that I'll use, again, going back to the idea that there's lots of ways to enjoy golf. I think there's multiple ways to be good at golf. I think you can be an artist or you can be a robot. So robots like to hit the same shot over and over and over and over again. And artists basically look at each shot as like, oh, this is a little right to left. It's a little into the wind, and I'm going to hold it off, or I'm going to draw it, I'm going to flight it. If you want to be more of an artist, then you have to be closer to neutral so that you can make adjustments. If you want to be more of a robot, then just having the club face like square in this, like having it preset or pre-flexed, that's going to be fine. You could probably get away with that. So you got to take a little look at yourself and how you like to play the game and capacity. But yeah, getting it closed sooner, I think for a lot of golfers is easier rather than trying to do it last minute.
But would limit your variety. Maybe that's why we don't see that many tour players doing it.
It could limit your variety. It could limit your power. So those, but for somebody who's only playing twice a week, that's probably not like the highest priority. But yeah, that's probably why we don't see a ton of it at the upper level.
Okay, so let's take a look at some couple last questions.
Yeah, probably got time for one more.
Okay, so a student makes perfect practice swings, but every time he sees the ball, the right arm and shoulder fire from the top, weight stays on the trail foot, and the path is 20 degrees left. How can maybe HackMotion help in this case? Practice.
Well, yeah. So often, I hear this a bit, and oftentimes what we think is a perfect practice swing actually wouldn't work when the golf ball was there. What I mean by that is oftentimes when people have a really like nice rhythmic practice swing, either the club face is wide open as it would approach impact, or the contact would be 4 to 6 inches before the golf ball. So then what we're finding is that this steepening movement that they're doing is moving the low point forward and closing the face. So what you can do with the HackMotion is you can, as long as you strike the ground hard enough to get a vibration, you can do a practice swing and you can compare the like the graphs to see, is it more of the wrist position and the motorcycle movement, or if that looks the same, then it's probably more of the contact location. If it's more the contact location, then I would look at your power source and making sure that you're not powering it by kind of spinning the shoulders, and then you're getting more of the rotation happening from kind of like below chest level rather than up in the neck and shoulders.
Okay, Tyler, that was great. I think we went through at least 20 questions, if not more. We have more coming in, and we'll try to cover them in our materials and creating more content with Tyler. It was really great for having you here. So if anybody's interested in more content from Tyler, head to Golf Smart Academy. We send the link also to all our users. You have access to this free HackMotion course where we break down the swing in different phases and how to understand the data. And you can do the drills that are also made according to this program, 93, 10 to 2. So
so the app does a great job of just kind of like presenting the drills on the website. I do like a little 2 to 5 minute video kind of talking through some of the key points for each drill that you want to watch out for.
Yeah, and then we have this special offer in July for trade-ins and for getting the new sensor. So if anybody's interested, then head to our homepage at hackmotion.com. All right, thanks a lot, Tyler. And everybody, thanks a lot for being here, and have a